The enemy sniper fired first not at a soldier, but at the medic crawling toward a wounded man in the snow. The bullet caught him in the shoulder and spun him sideways into the ice. Then the shooter on the ridge laughed. Through his radio, his voice crackled across the open frequency, taunting, slow, deliberate. "Send another one," he said. "I have time." Before you go any further, if this kind of story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Elena's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The cold arrived before anything else did. It came down from the peaks like something alive, something that had been waiting in the dark above the tree line for exactly this moment, when men were tired and bleeding and running low on everything that mattered. It poured into the valley in long, invisible sheets, and it did not stop. The kind of cold that did not just bite at exposed skin, but worked its way through layers, through wool and Gore-Tex and synthetic insulation, through flesh and muscle, and right down into bone. The kind of cold that made men question decisions they had made miles and miles ago. The kind of cold that made the idea of survival feel less like a plan and more like a wish. Private First Class Danny Reyes pressed himself against the interior wall of the shelter and pulled his knees to his chest. The shelter was a forward operating position built into a shallow rock overhang on the eastern edge of the valley floor. 4 walls of stacked stone reinforced with timber, a roof of corrugated steel that sang under the wind like something being slowly torn apart. There were 11 men inside. 2 of them were wounded. One of them, Sergeant Marcus Webb, had a bullet lodged somewhere near his left shoulder that the medic Corporal Ton could not safely remove without equipment that was still 40 minutes away on a helicopter that could not fly in this weather. Nobody talked about the helicopter anymore. Outside, the blizzard moved across the valley in great rotating walls of white. The snow was not falling so much as it was being thrown horizontally violently with the kind of force that felt personal. Visibility had dropped below 200 meters 3 hours ago and showed no signs of improving. The temperature at last reading was minus 28 Celsius. The wind chill made it feel like something no thermometer bothered to measure. And somewhere above them, at an elevation advantage of roughly 300 meters, on a ridge that the unit's maps labeled simply as Echo 7, an enemy sniper was waiting. He had been there for 6 hours. In those 6 hours, he had fired 9 confirmed shots. 3 had connected. 1 had killed Lance Corporal James Ortega. At 4 in the afternoon, a shot that came out of the white air with no warning at all, just a sound, and then James was down, and then James was gone. 2 shots had wounded others, Sergeant Webb being one of them. The remaining 6 shots had been precision misses close enough to force repositioning, close enough to make every attempted movement a calculation of acceptable risk. The distance from their shelter to the ridge was approximately 1,638 meters. That number had been spoken aloud in the shelter exactly once by Corporal Andre Mitchell, who had looked at his rangefinder reading and then looked up at the ridge and then looked back at the number and said it out loud, the way a man reads a death sentence. 1638, he had said. Nobody had responded. Nobody needed to. Because 1,638 meters in a blizzard, with winds ranging between 30 and 50 kilometers per hour on an uphill angle with visibility under 200 meters, was not a shot. It was not even a conversation. It was the kind of number that existed to remind men of the difference between what they were trained to do and what the universe was willing to allow. Sergeant First Class Ray Dominguez, the unit's senior NCO, had been on the radio for the last 2 hours trying to get them anything additional fire support, a helicopter extraction window, an artillery solution, anything at all. The responses had been consistent. Artillery could not safely engage at that angle without risk to the unit's own position. Fire support assets were committed elsewhere. Helicopter extraction required a visibility window of at least 500 meters minimum, and the weather system over the valley was projected to remain below that threshold for another 6 to 9 hours. 6 to 9 hours. Sergeant Webb had been losing blood steadily for 4 of those hours already. Dominguez ended his most recent radio call, set the handset down on the stone ledge beside him, and looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he looked at his men. His face was the face of a man who had run out of options, but had not yet run out of responsibility. "Sir," said Private Reyes quietly, not asking anything, just acknowledging that Dominguez was still there and still in charge, which at that moment felt like the most important thing in the world. Dominguez nodded once. "We stay tight. We stay low. We wait for a window." How long? Asked Corporal Mitchell. As long as it takes. Mitchell said nothing. He turned back toward the wall, which was what everyone did when they did not want the person in command to see what was on their face. What was on Mitchell's face, had Dominguez been looking, was the particular expression of a man who has done the math and did not like the answer. It was at approximately 6:47 in the evening, when the light outside had gone from gray to black and the storm had settled into a kind of rhythmic grinding consistency, that the shelter door opened. Not explosively, not dramatically. It opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side of it is being careful not to let in more cold than necessary. A controlled motion, deliberate, one hand on the frame, body angled to minimize the gap. A figure stepped through, pulled the door shut behind them, and stood still for a moment while their eyes adjusted. The figure was not tall, not short either, medium height, lean, wearing standard cold weather tactical gear that was coated in a film of ice crystals along every horizontal surface. The face was obscured behind a balaclava and goggles, but the goggles were lifted when the figure reached up and pulled them to the forehead in a single practiced motion, and then the balaclava came down, and the face underneath was a woman's face. Young, maybe 30, maybe a year or two either side of that. Dark eyes that moved around the shelter the way a camera sweeps a room, methodical, not rushed, taking inventory. No visible expression, no reaction to the 11 sets of eyes now fixed on her. She was carrying a rifle case that was almost as long as she was. Behind her came another figure, a man, older, broader, wearing the insignia of a logistics coordinator. He was breathing hard and had snow packed into every crease of his gear. His name was Warrant Officer Dale Simmons, and he had clearly not enjoyed the journey from wherever they had come from. Sergeant First Class Dominguez, Simmons said, not quite catching his breath. This is Staff Sergeant Elena Hart. She's been reassigned to your position, effective. Who authorized this? Dominguez asked. Brigade, command level. Simmons produced a folded document from an inside pocket and held it out. It's all there. Dominguez did not take the document immediately. He was looking at Elena Hart. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the wall, specifically at the rough sketch of the ridgeline that someone had drawn in charcoal on the stone face above the radio position. A crude topographical sketch done from memory, but accurate enough in its proportions. She was studying it the way a student studies a problem set before touching a pencil. Staff Sergeant, Dominguez said. She turned to look at him. Welcome to the worst day of our week, he said. Thank you for having me, she said. Her voice was even, not flat. There was something underneath it, some current running below the surface but measured. Controlled. Corporal Mitchell made a sound. It was not a word exactly. It was the sound a man makes when he has been awake for 18 hours, has watched a friend die, has 2 wounded men lying 2 feet away from him, and a woman with a rifle case has just walked in as if she is arriving for a job interview. You've got to be kidding me, he said. Dominguez shot him a look that could have cut glass. Mitchell caught it and redirected. Sir, no disrespect, but what exactly is the plan here? Because if the plan is what that case suggests the plan is, then I need someone to explain to me how that's a plan and not just... He stopped himself, looked at the case again. How is that a plan? Elena set the case down on the floor. She crouched beside it without sitting fully down, the crouch of someone who intended to be moving again soon. She unlatched the case and opened it, and what was inside was a precision long-range rifle system that several of the soldiers in the room recognized immediately, and the ones who recognized it went quiet in a different way than they had been quiet before. Private Reyes leaned toward Corporal Tan and said very quietly, "Is that what I think it is?" Corporal Tan studied the rifle for a moment. "If you think it's a specialized precision engagement system designed for extreme long-range targets in austere conditions, then yes." "She's going to try to shoot across 1,600 meters in a blizzard," Mitchell said. He did not say it as a question. He said it as a man naming a thing he cannot believe he is witnessing. "The range is 1638, Elena said without looking up from the case. She was checking components with the same deliberate, unhurried focus she had used to study the sketch on the wall. "Not 1,600. Precision matters at distance." Mitchell stared at her. "You're correcting my number. Your number is 38 meters short. At this range, that's not a rounding error. That's a completely different firing solution." The shelter was silent except for the sound of the wind working at the roof. Sergeant Webb, from his position against the far wall, turned his head slowly in the direction of Elena Hart and looked at her for a long time. Webb was pale. He had lost more blood than any of them wanted to acknowledge, and his face had the translucent quality of a man whose body was conducting an internal negotiation that had not yet reached a conclusion. But his eyes were sharp. Webb's eyes had always been sharp. "Can you make the shot?" Webb asked. Elena looked up from the case for the first time since crouching beside it. She looked directly at Webb. "I can calculate it," she said. "That's not what I asked. It's the most honest answer I can give you right now." Webb held her gaze. Then he nodded once slowly and laid his head back against the wall. Dominguez looked at Simmons. "What exactly is her record?" Simmons hesitated. The hesitation was its own kind of answer. "Her file is classified at a level above what I'm cleared to read. What I was told and what I'm authorized to share is that she has confirmed engagements at ranges that are not consistent with standard training parameters." "That tells me nothing." "That's the point, sir." Mitchell made the sound again, the one that was not quite a word. He stood up and moved to the far corner of the shelter, which was as far as the shelter allowed him to go, which was approximately 4 feet. He crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling with the focused intensity of a man deciding whether or not to say something out loud. He said it out loud. "Even if she were the best shooter on the planet," he said, "and I'm not saying she is or she isn't, I'm speaking mathematically, a shot at 1,600 meters requires a ballistic arc that in standard conditions already tests the boundary of practical accuracy. In these conditions, this wind, this temperature, this visibility, the variables multiply. The margin of error at that distance in this storm is not a margin, it's a continent. No shot lands at that distance, not in this." He gestured at the wall at the storm beyond it. "Not in this." Elena did not look up from what she was doing. "You've fired at 1,600 meters before?" she asked. Mitchell paused. "No. You've studied atmospheric ballistics at extreme range in sub-zero conditions." "I've read enough to—" "Oh, I'm not asking what you've read. I'm asking what you know from direct experience." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "With respect, I know enough to know what's realistic." Elena set down the component she was holding and looked at him for the first time. It was not a hostile look. It was not a dismissive look. It was the look of a person who is measuring the distance between two positions and determining whether the gap is bridgeable. "What's your name?" she asked. "Mitchell." "Corporal Mitchell," as she said, "I am not here to debate you. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to do a job, and I would find it useful if you could tell me everything your unit has observed about the ridge in the last 6 hours. Wind patterns, shot timing intervals between engagements. Anything that tells me about the environment up there. Can you do that?" Mitchell looked at Dominguez. Dominguez gave a very small nod. Mitchell uncrossed his arms. He was not happy. But he walked to the sketch on the wall and he started talking. He talked for 12 minutes. And what Elena Hart did during those 12 minutes was the thing that began slowly and without announcement to change the feeling inside the shelter. She listened. Not the way most people listen, half present, waiting for their turn to speak. She listened the way a musician listens to a piece of music for the first time, absorbing not just the notes, but the spaces between them. She asked 3 questions. Each question was precise, targeted, and revealed that she had already been processing what Mitchell said 3 sentences before he finished saying it. She asked, "The shot that hit Sergeant Webb, was there a lull in the wind immediately before the report?" Mitchell thought about it, thought harder, looked at Dominguez. Dominguez said, "Yeah, maybe 5-7 seconds." She asked, "The shots that were deliberate misses forcing repositioning, were they clustered around specific time intervals or random?" Silence. The men looked at each other. Private Reyes said slowly, "Now that you say it, they felt like they came in groups, like he'd fire a couple close ones and then go quiet for a while." She asked, "Has anyone tracked the quiet period?" Nobody had thought to. When you are on the receiving end of a sniper's attention, counting the intervals between his silence and his action is not the natural instinct. Elena nodded. She reached into a side pocket of her kit and produced a small notebook, battered waterproof, held together with 2 rubber bands. She opened it and began writing. Numbers, not words. Columns of numbers and calculations and notations that most of the men in the shelter could not have read even if they were standing directly over her shoulder. Private Reyes was in fact standing close enough to get a partial look. What he saw made no sense to him, but felt in some abstract way like looking at someone else's map of a territory you've always navigated by feel. "What is she writing?" he whispered to Corporal Tan. Tan looked, thought about it. "I think she's building the shot," he said. "Building it. Before you fire a round at that kind of range, you don't just point and shoot. You calculate wind, temperature, distance, the curvature of them." He paused. "It's physics. She's doing the physics." Right now. Reyes looked at Elena's bent head, at the moving pencil, at the numbers accumulating on the page. "How long does that take?" "I don't know," Tan said. "I've never seen anyone do it for real." At the radio position, Dominguez was back on the handset. His voice was low, but the shelter was not large enough to make a low voice private. The men heard fragments: weather window, timeline, extraction parameters. His responses to whatever was being said to him were monosyllabic, in the way of a man receiving information that does not help him, but that he must receive politely. He signed off and set the handset down. He looked at Elena's back. He looked at Webb, who had closed his eyes but whose chest was still moving in the shallow, controlled pattern of a man managing pain through conscious breathing. He looked at the door. Outside, the storm pressed against it like something trying to get in. Dominguez sat down on an ammunition crate, put his elbows on his knees, and for the first time in many hours, allowed his face to do whatever it wanted. What it wanted to do, apparently, was nothing. He sat and looked at the ground and breathed. Private Reyes watched him do it and felt something in his own chest loosen slightly. Not because the situation had improved. It hadn't. But there was something steady in watching a man who had run out of good options simply sit still and breathe. It was human. It was real. It was somehow more comforting than anything official or procedural could have been. After a while, Dominguez raised his head and looked at Elena again. "Staff Sergeant," he said. She didn't look up. "Yes." "When you said you can calculate it, what does that mean?" "Practically, what does it mean for tonight?" She finished the line she was writing before she answered. Then she looked up, but not at him, at the wall above the radio, at the charcoal sketch of the ridge. "It means," she said, "that before I fire this rifle, I will know exactly what this bullet needs to do to get from here to there. I will know the wind compensation. I will know the temperature adjustment. I will know the uphill angle correction. I will know the time of flight, which at this range is approximately 2 seconds. She paused. "What I cannot control is the moment. The wind is not consistent. There is no firing solution that holds at all times. So I don't shoot at all times." "Then when?" Dominguez asked. "When the mountain lets me," she said. Mitchell, still in his corner, said, "That's poetic. Practically speaking, what does that mean?" Elena turned to look at him directly. "It means I'm going to sit next to that wall and watch the storm. I'm going to watch the way the wind moves. I'm going to find the pattern inside what looks like chaos. And when I find the pattern, I'm going to find the window inside the pattern, and that's when I shoot." "And how long does that take?" "I don't know yet. Webb might not have—" "I know," she said. Quiet, flat, not cold, but not willing to pretend that that information changed anything about what she had just said. "I know that, Corporal, and I'm going to work as fast as the data allows. But I'm not going to fire a shot I don't believe in. A miss at this range doesn't just mean I failed. It means he marks my position, and then everything gets worse than it already is." The shelter was very quiet for a moment. Then Sergeant Webb opened his eyes. "She's right," he said. His voice was rough, but it was clear. "She's right, don't rush her." Mitchell looked at Webb. Something moved through his expression that was not surrender and was not agreement, but was somewhere in the space between them. He pressed his lips together and nodded once. Elena turned back to her notebook. Outside, the storm continued to throw itself against the mountain with the patience of something that did not experience time the way its occupants did. Inside, the shelter breathed. Elena Hart wrote numbers, and somewhere above them on a ridge, none of them could see a man with a rifle waited. He had been waiting all evening. He was, by the evidence of his work, very good at waiting. But he had never waited for Elena Hart before. He did not know she was there. He did not know what was being calculated in the shelter below. He did not know that the cold was not her enemy, that she had grown up in a part of the country where winters stripped everything down to its essential mathematics, where you either learned to read the wind or you suffered for the ignorance. He did not know any of that. He just waited as hunters wait with the certainty of a man who believes he has already won. On the valley floor in a shelter that smelled of sweat and gun oil, and something medicinal from Tan's kit, a woman who had been told her entire career that certain things were not possible, sat cross-legged on the cold ground with a notebook on her knee and calculated exactly how to make those things happen anyway. Private Reyes watched her for a while. Then he did something he had not done since this whole nightmare started. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, not because he was confident, not because he was at peace, but because watching someone work with that kind of quiet, total commitment to a problem was, he found, more settling than any speech or reassurance could have been. It was the quality of her certainty, not the performative certainty of someone trying to convince you, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that exists independent of whether anyone believes it. She was not calculating because she was trying to prove something to the men in the shelter. She was calculating because a bullet does not care about what people believe. It only cares about what is true. And Elena Hart's entire life had been spent learning the difference. 7:41 p.m. Elena had been sitting next to that wall for 54 minutes. She had not fired the rifle. She had not moved from her position except twice, once to recheck the data on her rangefinder and once to adjust the angle of the narrow observation gap she had cut through the insulation material covering the shelter's single forward-facing aperture. Through that gap, which was roughly the width of 2 fingers pressed together, she could see approximately 18 meters of usable sightline before the storm swallowed everything in white. It was not enough to see the ridge. It was barely enough to see the slope, but it was enough to read the wind. And reading the wind was all she was doing. Private Reyes had been watching her for most of those 54 minutes. Not staring, that felt wrong, felt intrusive, like watching someone pray, but watching the way you watch a fire when you need something to focus on. He had cataloged things without meaning to, the way her breathing had slowed down to something almost unnaturally even, the way her fingers moved across the pages of her notebook every few minutes, adding numbers, crossing things out, adding again, the way she never looked at the men around her, not because she was ignoring them, he had decided, but because she was somewhere else entirely inside the problem, inside the math, inside the invisible architecture of wind and cold and distance that existed between the shelter floor and the ridge above. At some point, Corporal Mitchell sat down. Not near Elena. He chose a position along the sidewall where he could see both her and the door simultaneously, which Reyes thought said something about Mitchell's psychology that Mitchell himself probably wasn't aware of. He sat down and took a long drink from his water container and stared at the far wall, and for about 10 minutes he was genuinely quiet. Then he said to nobody in particular, "How does she know how long the lulls last?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Dominguez said, "Ask her." Mitchell looked at Dominguez. Dominguez looked back. It was not a suggestion. It was a direction. Dominguez had the particular skill of making invitations sound inevitable. Mitchell exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he looked at Elena. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "how are you tracking the lull intervals? We don't have anemometer data. Weather station 2 kilometers east is offline. You're reading wind through a 2-inch gap in the insulation." Elena did not look up. "Correct." "So how—" "The sound," she said. Mitchell blinked. "The sound. The wind has a pitch. The pitch changes with velocity. I've been listening to the pattern of pitch changes for the last 50 minutes and cross-referencing it against the timing of the visible disturbance in the snow. I can see through the aperture. The 2 data points are correlating." She paused, still not looking up. "The lull pattern is approximately 18 to 22 minutes. Variable but consistent enough." The shelter was quiet for a moment. "You're reading the wind by its sound," Mitchell said slowly, "and building a timing model from that." "Yes." "And you trust that model enough to—" "No," she said, flat, clear. "I don't trust it yet. That's why I'm still sitting here." Mitchell opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the ceiling, then said with the tone of a man revising a position he had held for a long time, "How many more cycles do you need?" "At least 2 more confirmed," she said. "Maybe 3. That's another 40 to 60 minutes. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. They both knew what 40 to 60 minutes meant for Webb. Reyes looked across the shelter at Webb. Webb was awake, which was both a good sign and not. Awake meant conscious. But the color in his face was wrong, not quite gray, not quite white, something in between that Corporal Tan kept monitoring with the quiet vigilance of someone watching an instrument he hopes won't go critical. Tan had done everything he could. The bleeding had slowed. The shoulder was packed and wrapped. The real issue now was systemic blood loss accumulated the body's response to sustained trauma in extreme cold, the clock that every combat medic learns to read from the moment they are trained. Reyes looked back at Elena. He did something then that he would remember for the rest of his life. He made a decision to trust her, not because she had given him a reason to, not because the evidence supported it, not because he felt good about it. He made the decision the way you make decisions in a dark room when you can't see the furniture. You pick a direction and you commit to it because standing still is its own kind of choice, and you don't like what it costs you. He stood up, walked to his kit, pulled out a protein bar, walked to Elena and set it down beside her notebook without saying anything. She glanced at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said. "You've been working for almost an hour," he said. "I know." "Do you," he stopped, started again. "Do you do this a lot?" "Sit and calculate before the shot." She looked back at her notebook. "Always." "How long usually, I mean? How long does it usually take?" She was quiet for a moment. "Depends on the conditions." "What's the longest you've ever taken?" She picked up the protein bar, turned it over once in her hands, the way you handle something that reminds you of something else, and then set it back down without opening it. 4 hours and 17 minutes, she said. Reyes absorbed that. "Did you get the shot?" She looked up at him then, really looked. And for just a moment, the measured, calculated surface of her expression shifted, and underneath it, he saw something, not pride, not quite satisfaction, something more complicated than either of those words. "Yes," she said. He nodded, went back to his spot. Mitchell had heard the exchange. He was looking at the floor now, turning something over in his head that he was not ready to say aloud yet. 8:19 p.m. The storm hit a new intensity. The roof sang louder. Two of the men near the back wall shifted involuntarily, instinctive physical response to an auditory threat they couldn't address. Dominguez said quietly but audibly, "It's the roof, it holds." He said it the same way twice, which was the right call. The second time was for the men who needed to hear it, and more than once. Elena pressed her eyes to the observation gap. She stayed there for exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Reyes was counting, because counting was something to do. Then she pulled back, picked up her pencil, and wrote 4 lines of numbers. Fast, certain. The kind of writing that happens when you are not composing, but recording when the thought is already complete and you are just putting it down before it moves. "Third cycle," she said, not to anyone in particular, to the notebook. Dominguez looked up. "Confirmed. 17 minutes, 50 seconds. She wrote again, "Within expected variance." Mitchell stood up. He did it without deciding to the kind of movement that happens before your conscious mind catches up to it. He walked to the center of the shelter, which was the closest position to her that didn't feel like crowding, and said, "You're close." "Getting there," she said. "What else do you need?" It was Reyes noticed the first time Mitchell had asked that question. Every question before had been a challenge, a test of skepticism expressed in interrogative form. This one was different. This one was the question of a man who has started doing the math in a new way. Elena looked up at him. The look was brief, assessing. "1 more confirmed cycle, clear barrel check, and I need someone on time for me when I fire, calling seconds from 0 so I can maintain focus on the scope." "I can do that," Mitchell said. She held his gaze for a moment. "You can count to 30 under pressure. I can count to 100 under pressure. 30 is enough. The bullet reaches the target before that." "How long exactly?" 2.09 seconds at this range. "I'll hear the result before you finish counting 3. Mitchell let that land. Let the specific number, the precision of it, work on him the way it was designed to. 2.09, he repeated. Plus or minus 0.04 depending on actual wind at point of travel. You know the travel time to within 0.04 of a second if I know the physics, she said. I don't know the wind's decisions. That's the variable I can't fully eliminate. Mitchell looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised Reyes, surprised Dominguez, probably surprised Mitchell himself. He reached out and extended his hand. "Andre Mitchell," he said, "Corporal, 4 years infantry, not a sniper." Elena looked at the hand, then she took it. "Elena Hart, 8 years, not much else." They shook once brief and real. Then she went back to the numbers. 8:53 p.m. Webb made a sound, not a cry. Webb was past making sounds like that had gone somewhere inside himself that was quieter and more internal, but a sharp, involuntary exhale that snapped every head in the shelter toward him simultaneously. Tan was beside him in 2 steps, kneeling, checking, running through his assessment with the focused speed of professional training. "I'm okay," Webb said. He did not sound okay. He sounded like a man describing a country he had once lived in and was no longer sure he could get back to. "Heart rate's up," Tan said quietly. "We need to get him warm. His core temp is—" "I know," Webb said. "I know. Don't tell Dominguez yet." "Webb, give her time." Webb turned his head slowly toward Elena's position. In the low light of the shelter, 2 battery lanterns and a chemical glow stick that was fading. His eyes were still sharp, still tracking. "She's building something. Don't knock it over." Tan looked at Elena, looked back at Webb, made a decision that was not entirely medical. "5 more minutes," he said. "Thank you," Webb said. Dominguez had heard most of it. He stood up and walked to Tan. They had a conversation in low voices that lasted about 40 seconds. And at the end of it, Dominguez's jaw was set at the angle it got when he was carrying something he could not put down. He walked back to his position, picked up the radio handset, and had another brief exchange with the command. The response, whatever it was, did not change his expression. He set the handset down and looked at Elena. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I need a read, honest." She looked up from the notebook. "Webb is deteriorating," he said. "Not fast, but real. I need to know where you are." She held his gaze. "I need 1 more confirmed lull cycle, based on the current pattern that's approximately 18 to 20 minutes from now. And after the cycle, I fire during the following lull. So 35 to 45 minutes. If the pattern holds," she said, "if it accelerates sooner. If it breaks," she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Then I recalculate." Dominguez looked at her the way a man looks at a bridge he is not sure will hold his weight. Not with distrust, with the specific attention of someone who understands that the only way to know is to step onto it. "All right," he said. He walked back to his position. Nobody spoke for about 6 minutes. The storm moved outside. The roof made its sounds. The chemical glow stick dimmed another degree toward dead. Then Mitchell said from his position near Elena, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, "Can I ask you something?" Elena glanced at him. "Yes." "The 4-hour, 17-minute shot, where was that?" She was quiet for a moment. "Can't say." "Okay, what was the range?" Another pause. "Farther than this." Mitchell processed that. "And the conditions worse," she said. He looked at the wall. "How is this possible?" "What I said before, mathematically, the dispersion at this range." "Dispersion is real," she said, "but dispersion is a range, not a fixed point. The math tells you where the bullet probably goes. The skill is in making probably into actually." She paused. "And the patience is in waiting until the window makes actually possible." "But the variables are just variable," she said. "You account for them?" "All of them. People say a shot is impossible because they're accounting for some of the variables and estimating the rest. I account for all of them, the ones you can measure and the ones you have to infer." She turned her head and looked at him directly. "It's not magic, Corporal. It's just more math than most people are willing to do." Mitchell absorbed this for a long time. Then very quietly he said, "I said it couldn't be done." "Yes." "In front of the whole unit." "Yes." "I was wrong." She looked at him for a moment. "You were working with incomplete information," she said. "Don't be too hard on yourself." He made a sound. It was different from all the sounds he had made before. This one was smaller, more personal. The sound of a man recalibrating something fundamental. 9:17 p.m. Elena put down her pencil. She did it with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. She closed the notebook, slid it into her left pocket, and began the preparation sequence for the rifle with the focused, sequential precision of someone executing a process they have internalized so completely it no longer requires conscious thought. Every man in the shelter noticed. Nobody said anything. She worked through the checks systematically, and as she did, the atmosphere inside the shelter underwent a shift that was real and physical, a tightening, a collecting inward, like the moment before thunder, when the air changes pressure and the body knows it before the mind names it. Private Reyes felt his heart rate change. He felt it in his throat the way hearts sometimes make themselves known when they have something to say. He pressed his back against the wall and gripped his own knees and breathed. Webb opened his eyes. They had been closed for the last several minutes. He opened them now, and there was something in them. Not relief, not yet, but the precursor to relief, the small doorway that opens before you. Know for certain whether you will be allowed through. Tan sat back on his heels. He had been monitoring Webb's pulse every 3 minutes. He stopped for the first time in an hour. He put his hands in his lap and looked at Elena. Mitchell moved to his position, the one she had given him. He pulled out his watch and held it in his hand without activating it ready. Dominguez stood at the back of the shelter and watched all of it with the still comprehensive attention of a man whose only remaining job is to witness clearly and be ready for whatever comes next. Elena moved to the aperture. The rifle was up. She spent 3 minutes in the aperture without moving, without firing, breathing in the long, controlled pattern that Reyes had learned from reading something somewhere was part of the discipline. Breathing the body down to its stillest point, slowing the heartbeat, reducing the physical interference between the shooter and the trigger to its absolute minimum. 2 minutes and 40 seconds into those 3 minutes, the storm shifted. The sound changed. The pitch of the wind dropped in the way she had been predicting. Not silence, not calm, but a relative quieting, a lowering of intensity that was measurable only if you had been listening for it as carefully as she had been listening for the last 2.5 hours. She said one word, now. Mitchell started counting. His voice was low and steady. 1, 2, 3. The rifle fired. The sound inside the shelter was enormous. Contained concussive filling the stone walls with a percussion that seemed to compress the air and release it simultaneously. 2 men flinched. Reyes did not flinch because he had been holding so still in anticipation that his body had nowhere left to go. The bullet left the muzzle at a velocity that physics would carry across 1,638 meters of frozen air across 2 seconds and 9/100ths of a second of flight time across every variable that Elena Hart had spent 2.5 hours accounting for. Mitchell counted. 4, 5. Elena did not move. Her eyes stayed at the scope. Her breathing did not change. 6, 7. The shelter held its breath. Reyes realized he was holding his. He did not release it. 8, 9, 2.09 seconds. Elena exhaled. Miss, she said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Then she said with the same voice, the same register, no more emotion than the word before it, he moved. Nobody spoke. He moved just before I fired, she said, pulling back from the aperture. A shift in position, 40 to 60 centimeters left. She was already reaching for the notebook. He heard the wind change. He knows to move when the wind drops. Mitchell lowered his watch. His face was the face of a man absorbing a blow he had been hoping not to have to absorb. Dominguez said, he'll mark your position. Yes, she said, which means he knows we have a shooter. Yes, which means, it means, Elena said, already writing again, already recalculating, already building the next version of the problem, that we're in a different situation than we were 5 minutes ago. She looked up. Her face was still even, still without performance, but her eyes were doing something that Reyes could not name and would spend a long time afterward trying to. He moved, she said, so I learn how he moves. And next time I account for that too. Outside, the storm had resumed its full intensity, and somewhere on the ridge above, a man who had just heard a shot come from below him, a shot he had not expected from a range he had considered safe, was no longer certain of anything. He had been certain of an hour ago, which meant in the specific and terrible arithmetic of this situation that something had changed. Not in Elena's favor, not yet, but something. 9:22 p.m. The shot from the ridge came 4 minutes and 31 seconds after Elena's miss. Not at the aperture, not at the observation gap she had used. It came through the upper left corner of the forward wall, a precise, deliberate impact that punched through the stone mortar between 2 rocks at a point roughly 11 inches above where Private Reyes had been sitting 12 seconds earlier. 12 seconds earlier, he had shifted his position to hand Corporal Tan a chemical heat pack from the supply kit, and that shift, that random, unremarkable, logistical 12-second movement, was the only reason the bullet that screamed through the shelter wall and buried itself in the timber beam on the far side did not take the back of his skull with it. Reyes understood this approximately 2 seconds after it happened. He sat on the floor where he had ended up after the impact threw everyone flat by instinct, And he looked at the hole in the wall, and then he looked at the spot where he had been sitting, and then he looked at the hole again. And he said nothing. There were no words inside him that were accessible yet. There was only the very loud, very physical fact of his own continued existence, which felt at that moment less like something he had earned and more like something borrowed. Dominguez was already moving. Down, everyone down and against the back wall, now. His voice did not rise. It never rose. It just acquired a particular edge that moved men without requiring volume. Mitchell was already flat. He had been flat before the bullet cleared the wall, the kind of reaction that lives in the body independent of the brain, written there by enough training and enough close calls. He crawled to the right side and stayed low. Elena had not moved from her position. She was still in the crouch she had assumed after pulling back from the aperture notebook, open pencil in hand. The impact had not changed her posture. She had not flinched. She had, and this was the thing that Reyes, looking over from the floor, could not entirely process, she had written something in the notebook at the exact moment the bullet came through the wall. Dominguez saw it too. "Staff Sergeant, back wall, right now." "He moved left to fire that shot," she said, writing. 40 to 60 centimeters left of his previous position. That's consistent with his earlier repositioning pattern. He doesn't stay still after a threat engagement. Elena. Dominguez used her first name. It was the first time he had. It landed differently than rank. "Get to the back wall." She looked at him. Read the seriousness in his face the way she read everything directly and completely without drama. Then she moved. She kept the notebook. She kept writing even as she repositioned. Dominguez watched her do it and decided in the internal way that commanders make decisions that he was going to let it go. Webb's voice came from the corner, low but steady. "Tan?" "I'm here," Tan said, already moving toward him. "Did it hit anyone?" "No," Tan said. "Someone?" A silence. Then Webb said, "Good." Just the one word. With the weight of a man who has spent the last several hours conducting a private negotiation between himself and his own body about how much longer they were going to cooperate with each other and has not yet reached a final answer. Reyes finally found words. What came out was not what he expected. What came out was, "He aimed above where I was." Mitchell turned his head. "What?" "The shot. It came through 11 inches above where I was sitting." "That's..." Reyes stopped, working through it. "That's not a ranging shot. That's not a random impact point. He knew where we were. He knew someone had been sitting at that wall. He was trying to kill me. He was trying to kill the shooter," Elena said from the back wall. Everyone looked at her. He heard the report. He triangulated the muzzle position from the sound. "He's calculating from the same direction I'm calculating from." She looked up from the notebook. "He knows I'm in this shelter. He doesn't know exactly where inside it, but he knows the approximate firing position, and he fired just above it. He's hunting me." The sentence sat in the room for a long moment. Corporal Mitchell said slowly, the way he now said most things, "If he's hunting you, then every time you go to that aperture, he fires," she said. "Yes. Then you can't use the aperture." "Not the same one." Mitchell looked at the wall, the forward wall, one hole in it, new ragged mortar, dust still settling. "You want to make another one?" "I want to make two," she said. "Different heights, different positions, so he can't predict which one I'll use." Dominguez said, "That means exposing the wall to cutting. In these temperatures, every new gap is a heat loss we can't recover." "I know," she said. "It also means making noise while he's in a heightened state." "I know. And if he hears the cutting, he fires at the sound," she said. "Yes, which is why I'm not doing it right now." She closed the notebook. "I'm doing it during the next lull, when the storm noise covers the work." Dominguez looked at her for a long time. The look of a man who has realized that the decision tree he thought he was climbing has been replaced by a different tree, one with branches he didn't expect. "All right," he said. "Who has a knife and a tool that can work stone mortar?" 9:44 p.m. The work took 11 minutes and cost Mitchell the skin on 2 knuckles, which he did not mention until Tan noticed the blood and handed him a field dressing without comment. The new apertures were higher and further left than the original, not dramatically but enough. Enough to change the geometry, enough to make his previous calculations about her position require revision. Elena had supervised the cutting with the same focused attention she applied to everything. She had specified the exact height and width of each gap with measurements she produced from memory, and when Mitchell looked at her for explanation, she said, "The sightline needs to intersect the ridge at an angle that compensates for the barrel temperature differential." Mitchell had nodded as if this made complete sense to him, which it did not, but he was no longer in the business of challenging her premises. The storm was doing something complicated outside. Not breaking, not close to breaking, but shifting. The wind had changed character in the last hour, which Elena had been tracking, and which she explained to Dominguez in terms that were specific and clinical, and which Dominguez absorbed without pretending to fully understand the physics. What he understood was this: the lull pattern was changing. The 18 to 22-minute cycle she had identified was compressing. The lulls were getting shorter and less predictable. "Which means your window is shrinking," he said. "Which means I have fewer attempts," she said. "Possibly only one more clean one." Dominguez sat with that. One more clean window. One more chance to fire a shot that traveled 2 seconds and 9/100ths of a second across 1,638 meters of frozen mountain air at a target that now knew she was there and was actively repositioning to make himself harder to hit. "How long to the next lull?" he asked. "Unknown," she said. "The pattern is disrupted. I'm rebuilding the model." "How long to rebuild it?" "I don't know yet." 10:08 p.m. Webb stopped talking, not because he lost consciousness. He was still awake. Tan confirmed it with a gentle check every few minutes, a quiet word that Webb responded to with a nod or a single syllable. But the talking stopped, and its absence was its own kind of communication. Webb had been a talker, not a noisy man, not a loud man, but one of those people who processes things externally, who works through situations by verbalizing them, who fills silences with observation. His going quiet was the shelter's barometer dropping. Private Reyes noticed it before anyone said anything about it. He noticed it, and he looked at Tan, and Tan looked back at him with the careful, neutral expression of a medic who has information he is managing. Reyes moved to Webb's position. He sat down beside him, not too close, the way you sit beside someone who needs presence more than proximity. "Hey," Reyes said. Webb turned his head. "Hey, yourself." "You went quiet." "Tired," Webb said. "Tan says your color is coming back." Webb looked at him. Webb, who had been reading people his entire adult life and who was currently running on reserves he could not fully account for, looked at Reyes with the clear, undiluted gaze of a man who knows the difference between a lie offered with kindness and the truth. "Is that what Tan says?" he said. Reyes held the look. "We're working on it," he said, which was the truth. Webb was quiet for a moment. "Then she's good, isn't she? The shooter." "I think so." "What changed Mitchell's mind?" Reyes considered the question. "The numbers," he said finally. "She talks in numbers, and the numbers make sense. Even when you can't follow all of them, you can feel that they make sense." Webb made a small sound that might have been a laugh in a different setting. "That's a strange thing to trust," he said. "Numbers you can't follow." "I know," Reyes said, "but it's what I've got." Webb closed his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." 10:21 p.m. The second shot from the ridge came without warning at 10:21 and 11 seconds. It did not come through the wall. It came through the door. Not the door itself, the hinge side where the door met the frame, a gap of perhaps 2 centimeters that existed because the wood had warped in the cold and the metal hinges had contracted. A 2-centimeter gap at a distance of 1,600 meters, and the bullet found it. It did not find anyone on the other side. It passed through the gap and buried itself in the back wall at shin height, which would have been catastrophic for anyone standing, but which, given that everyone in the shelter had been staying low since the first impact, found only stone and timber. But the psychological effect of a bullet finding a 2-centimeter gap in a door from 1,600 meters in a blizzard was not a physical injury and did not require one to do its damage. Mitchell said something that was not a word in any language. Dominguez said nothing. He pressed himself against the lateral wall and breathed. Reyes beside Webb had pulled his knees up involuntarily. Webb had not moved. Webb's eyes were still closed. Elena at the back wall looked at the new impact point for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened the notebook. "Different position again," she said. "Further right this time. He moved right to take the door angle." She wrote, "He's not staying anywhere. He's moving between shots." He's a pro, Dominguez said. Flat, acknowledged. Yes, she said. He's very good. Can you hit someone who keeps moving? She looked up. Not the way I was calculating. The previous firing solution assumed a stationary target. She paused. I have to build a new model, one that accounts for where he's likely to be, not where I last saw him. Mitchell turned from the door. His face was pale in the dim light, but his voice was controlled. You're going to predict his position. I'm going to calculate his pattern, she said. He moves, but he doesn't move randomly. Nobody does, especially under pressure. Under pressure, people move in ways that feel random, but are actually constrained by their training, their physiology, their habits. She looked at the notebook. Every shot he's fired, I know the angle. I know the approximate position. I'm mapping his movement pattern the same way I map the wind. The shelter was very quiet. Then Mitchell said, and the word came out softer than he intended. That's extraordinary. She did not respond to that. She wrote, 10:39 p.m. Dominguez got back on the radio. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Reyes listened to Dominguez's side of it and did not like what he heard, which was mostly monosyllables and the kind of careful military-grade understatement that exists to make terrible information sound manageable. When Dominguez came off the radio, he looked at Tan. Tan looked back. The exchange between them was 2 seconds and completely silent and contained everything. Then Dominguez looked at Elena. Command is pushing the extraction window estimate to 4 to 6 hours from now, he said. Weather system is not breaking on schedule. They're sending a medical asset by ground if the road conditions allow ETA uncertain. Nobody needed him to explain what 4 to 6 hours meant for Webb. The math was simple, and everyone had already done it. Elena looked up from the notebook. She held Dominguez's gaze, and he held hers, and in that held gaze was an entire conversation that required no words, and that everyone in the shelter could feel, even if they could not hear it. She went back to the notebook, 10:53 p.m. Reyes had been watching Elena work for the last 30 minutes and thinking about something he could not quite name until it finally named itself. What he was watching was not he realized what he had thought it was. He had thought he was watching someone try to solve a problem. What he was actually watching was someone refuse to accept that a problem was unsolvable. Those were different things. The first was a technical exercise. The second was a choice, a moral choice almost, a decision about the nature of reality and what human beings were allowed to insist on in the face of it. He thought about his grandmother, who had raised him in a house where the heat didn't always work, and the money didn't always stretch, and the solutions didn't always exist, and who had nonetheless operated every single day as if solutions were available to those willing to look carefully enough and wait patiently enough and work hard enough. He had thought of it as stubbornness when he was young. He understood now, watching Elena Hart, that stubbornness and this were not the same thing. Stubbornness was refusal based on emotion. This was refusal based on a different and more rigorous belief. The belief that the math always has an answer, and the answer can be found in time if you are willing to do what the math requires. He didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't the kind of thing you said out loud in a shelter with a man bleeding in the corner and bullets coming through the walls. But he thought it, and thinking it changed something in the way he was sitting. He sat up a little straighter. He breathed a little more deliberately. He stopped calculating the odds of survival and started calculating what he could do that would be useful. Tan, he said quietly, what do you need from me? Tan looked at him, assessed. Keep him talking, he said. Just keep him talking. Reyes nodded and turned back to Webb. 11:04 p.m. Elena said Mitchell. Mitchell was at her side in 4 steps. He had not been far. In the last hour, without anyone commenting on it, he had migrated to a position near her, not hovering, but available. The distance of a man who has reconsidered his position and is now trying to be useful to the person he was previously trying to argue out of the room. I have his pattern, she said. Mitchell crouched beside her. She turned the notebook so he could see the page. He looked at it, the columns of numbers, the angles, the directional notations that mapped each of the enemy's firing positions across the evening. He favors his right, she said, tracing a line through the data with her pencil. Every time he repositions after a shot, he moves right before he moves anywhere else. It's a small bias, maybe 30-40 centimeters, but it's consistent across all 7 observed positions. She tapped the last column. Based on the pattern after his last shot from the door angle, he should have moved back left to approximately here. She indicated a point on the rough ridge sketch she had transferred to the notebook, which is close to his original position from the early evening. He cycles. Mitchell stared at the sketch. He goes back to positions he's already used. Not exactly, he varies, but the range of his movement has limits. He's working within a comfort zone on that ridge positions he's already checked, already knows. She looked at Mitchell. He's disciplined, but discipline creates pattern. And pattern creates a target, Mitchell said. Yes. He looked at the notebook for another long moment. Then he looked at her. How confident are you in this position estimate? She paused before answering, which was its own kind of answer. 70%, she said. In these conditions with the data I have, 70% is as high as I can honestly put it. 30% chance you're wrong. 30% chance the position is off by more than I can compensate for, she said, which means 30% chance this shot also misses. And if it misses, she was quiet for a second, he fires back within 5 minutes. He knows exactly where I have to be to take the shot. He's been watching this shelter the same way I've been watching that ridge. She closed the notebook. If I miss again, the probability of a successful third attempt drops significantly. Mitchell sat back. The weight of the math sat on both of them. Dominguez, who had been listening from 3 feet away, said, "What do you need to make the shot?" Elena turned to him. "The next lull, the one after that if it's too short, clear barrel, and I need everyone in this shelter to be completely still and silent from the moment I say ready until the moment I fire." She looked around at the men. Sound travels in cold air. Any noise I don't account for could give him a fraction of a second's warning. Every man in the shelter looked at her, and then one by one each of them nodded. Even Webb, eyes still closed, head against the wall but nodding. A single, slow, certain movement of his head, and if he had heard at every word through whatever internal state he was now operating from, and was registering his agreement in the only currency currently available to him. Elena stood. She picked up the rifle. And somewhere in the storm above them, in the dark, in the howling absence of light, a man who had controlled this valley all evening repositioned himself, almost certainly based on her calculations, to the right toward a specific point on a specific ridge, a point that existed not in the real world yet, but in the columns of a battered waterproof notebook held by a woman who had spent 4 hours reading him, the same way she had spent 4 hours reading the storm. She moved to the new aperture. She settled into position. She became still. And the storm, enormous and indifferent, moved around the mountain the way it always had, the way it always would, without caring about the men below, or the woman at the wall, or the invisible thread of calculation stretching from her eye to a point 1,638 meters away through the dark. But Elena Hart cared. She cared with the specific total consuming focus of someone for whom caring and calculating were the same act, both of them ways of insisting that the world respond to the mind that meets it honestly and without flinching. She waited. The notebook was in her left pocket. The rifle was in her hands. The mountain breathed. And she listened for the moment when it would breathe right. 11 p.m. She had been at the aperture for 7 minutes when the radio crackled. Dominguez grabbed his handset before the second burst of static pressed it to his ear, turned his body away from the room. His voice was barely above a breath. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. When he turned back, his face had done something new. Something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but existed in the territory between them, the place where commanders go when the information they carry is too heavy for a single expression. He looked at Tan. Tan read his face, stood up slowly. They moved to the far corner together, as far from Webb as the shelter allowed, which was not far enough for what Dominguez said next, but far enough that Webb, whose eyes were closed and whose breathing had taken on the shallow, deliberate quality of someone rationing effort, did not need to hear it directly. "Ground medical asset is stuck 2 kilometers east," Dominguez said. "Road is impassable. They're trying to find an alternate route. ETA is now unknown." Tan absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. "His core temperature is dropping," Tan said very quietly. "Not fast, but the trend line is not where I want it. How long does he have before the trend line becomes a crisis?" Tan was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, maybe 2 hours, Maybe less if his pressure drops further. Dominguez pressed his lips together. What do you need? Warmth I can't generate. Blood volume I can't replace. A hospital that isn't 40 minutes away by helicopter in weather that won't allow helicopters. Tan paused. And more time than I'm sure we have. Dominguez looked at Elena's back, at the still, settled line of her shoulders at the aperture, at the rifle which had not moved, which had become so integrated with her posture that it no longer looked like a separate object, but like an extension of her body, a physical expression of the calculations still running inside her. She has to make this shot, Dominguez said. I know, Tan said. She has to make it soon. I know. Dominguez walked back to his position. He did not tell the rest of the shelter what had just been said. He sat down, put his elbows on his knees, and looked at Elena the way a man looks at the one thing standing between him and an outcome he cannot accept. 11:19 p.m. Private Reyes was talking to Webb. He had been talking to Webb for 20 minutes following Tan's instruction, maintaining the connection, keeping him present. He talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this, about his family in San Antonio, about his mother's cooking, about a dog he had when he was 9 years old that used to sleep across his feet in winter and make his legs go numb, and how he had never minded it not once. Because the weight of something alive and warm on your feet in winter was one of the best feelings he had ever experienced. Webb listened with his eyes closed. Every few minutes he made a small sound, not words, but acknowledgement. Presence. The sound of someone choosing actively to keep participating in the conversation even when participation required effort. At 11:19, Webb said, Reyes. Yeah. Stop talking about the dog. Reyes blinked. Okay, what do you want me to talk about? Webb was quiet for a moment. Is she still at the wall? Reyes looked. Yeah, she hasn't moved. How long has she been there? Since 11:04, 15 minutes. Webb made a sound, somewhere between acknowledgement and something else. She's gonna do it, he said. Reyes looked at him. Yeah. Webb shifted slightly, the smallest adjustment of position contained controlled. You know how I know? How? Because she's still there. She already knows she has the answer. She's just waiting for the mountain. He paused. Most people, when they know the answer, they act. They can't help it. The knowing makes them move. She's different. She can hold the knowing and not act until the acting is right. Another pause. That's not common. Reyes thought about that. Where did you learn to read people like that? 12 years, Webb said, and a lot of being wrong first. Reyes almost smiled. Almost. Webb. Yeah. You're going to be fine. Webb opened his eyes, looked at him directly. You're not a good liar, Danny. No, Reyes admitted. I'm really not. Webb closed his eyes again. Keep talking about the toe, he said. It was a good story. 11:27 p.m. The lull arrived without announcement, the way all real things arrive. Not with the drama the waiting builds toward, but quietly, almost without emphasis. Just a subtle drop in the pitch of the wind that Elena had been listening for with the entirety of her attention for the last 23 minutes. Her breathing changed. That was the only signal. Mitchell was close enough to see it. The almost imperceptible shift in her respiratory rhythm from the long, slow, meditative breathing of the waiting state into something shallower, more precise, more deliberate. The breathing of a person who has moved from calculation into action. He raised his watch without making a sound. Elena said one word, ready. Every person in the shelter went still simultaneously. It was not coordinated. Nobody had planned it. It happened the way certain things happen in small groups under extreme pressure, organically, instinctively, the group becoming a single organism in response to a moment that required it. Even Webb against the far wall seemed to hold himself differently. Smaller, quieter. The storm pressed against the exterior walls. Elena breathed in, held, breathed out to 60% capacity, held again. Her right index finger moved. The rifle fired. The sound was the same as before, contained, massive, filling the stone walls and releasing. Two men flinched. Mitchell did not flinch. He started counting the instant the sound peaked. 1, 2. Elena did not move. Her eye was locked to the scope. Her body was stone. She was tracking something no one else in the room could see, following the invisible arc of a bullet across a distance that the dark and the storm made theoretical to everyone but her. 3, 4. The shelter breathed around her. Nobody moved. 5. 2.09 seconds. Elena exhaled. She said nothing. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, the shelter was the loudest quiet any of them had ever experienced. A silence that was not empty, but full-packed with the suspended weight of everything that depended on what she was about to say. Then Mitchell said, unable to stop himself, his voice barely above a breath, "Elena." She pulled back from the aperture, turned. Her face was the same as it always was, controlled, measured, the calculation still visible in her eyes, but something else was there now. Something she was holding alongside the calculation, something that was not quite emotion and was not quite its absence. "Wind shifted at the moment of firing," she said. Later than the previous cycle. 15 degrees off my compensation angle." Mitchell felt the words hit his chest like something physical. "Miss Dominguez said." She looked at him. "I don't know yet." "You don't?" There was no impact confirmation at the expected point of strike. She said it carefully, precisely the way she said everything. "But the wind shift was late enough that the bullet's terminal path may have compensated partially. I cannot confirm impact or miss from this position." She looked at the aperture. "I need a second data point." "Meaning what?" Mitchell said. "Meaning I need to observe the ridge position for the next 3 to 5 minutes to determine whether he repositions or doesn't." "If he repositions, you missed," Dominguez said. "If he repositions, I missed," she confirmed. "And if he doesn't reposition?" She was quiet for exactly 1 second. "Then he can't." The shelter held that sentence. Then from the corner, Webb's voice came, weak but present. "What does she see?" Nobody answered immediately, because nobody knew yet, and the not knowing was its own kind of climate pressing to airless the specific weight of a moment that hasn't resolved yet and holds everything inside it unreleased. Elena moved back to the aperture. She pressed her eye to it. She watched. The storm moved outside, the roof sang, the chemical glow stick had died at some point in the last hour, and the only light was the 2 battery lanterns, which gave everything the amber quality of a room seen from underwater. 40 seconds, 60 seconds, 90. Mitchell's watch ticked. He had not lowered it. He held it the way people hold things when they need something physical to grip. 2 minutes. Elena said nothing. Did not move. Gave nothing. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Reyes realized he had been holding the same position for so long that his left leg had gone partially numb. He did not move. The numbness seemed unimportant. 3 minutes. And then Elena said in a voice so controlled it was almost mechanical, and underneath the control was something vast and real and human. "He hasn't moved." Nobody breathed. 3 minutes and no repositioning. No indication of threat response. No second shot. She pulled back from the aperture slowly, deliberately, with a careful movement of someone handling something fragile. She turned to face the shelter. Her face was still controlled. But her hands, Reyes noticed. Her hands, which had been stone still for 4 hours for every moment of the waiting and the calculating, and the 2 previous shots, her hands were trembling. Not dramatically, not visibly from a distance, but he was close enough to see it. A faint, fine tremor in her fingers, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the release of a sustained tension that the body has been holding so long, it doesn't know immediately how to let it go. "Impact confirmed," Dominguez asked. "Impact probable," she said. "High probability, not 100% without visual confirmation." "What's the percentage?" She paused. 92. Dominguez looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That's enough for me." Mitchell made a sound. This one was different from all his previous sounds. This one was not skepticism or frustration or resistance. This one was the sound of a man releasing something he had been carrying for several hours, something that had been heaviest, Reyes suspected, because of how loudly he had claimed it was true. He put his hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment, then he took them away, and he looked at Elena and he said, "You did it." She looked at him. "Probably." 92% is not 100, as she said. "I don't claim what I can't confirm." But Mitchell was not arguing. He was shaking his head slowly, the way people shake their heads at things they are going to be thinking about for a very long time. 92% at 1638 meters in a blizzard against a moving target from a compromised position with a disrupted lull pattern. He stopped shaking his head, looked at her directly. How? I told you, she said. More math than most people are willing to do. 11:51 p.m. The shelter did not erupt. There was no cheering. No one shouted. What happened was quieter than that and more real. A collective exhale, a physical loosening, the releasing of something that had been held tight for so many hours that its release felt less like relief and more like the first breath after surfacing. Reyes went straight to Webb. Webb's eyes were open. He had heard everything. 92%, Reyes said. Webb looked at him, then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. Webb did not have a full smile available right now, but the fraction of one, the beginning of a thing that would be a smile when he had more to work with. That'll do, he said. Time was already adjusting. He moved with a new quality of purposefulness, not different in technique, but different in what was behind the technique. 5 minutes ago, he had been working against a clock he was not sure he could outrun. Now he was working towards something. It was a small difference in the facts. It was an enormous difference in the human being doing the work. Dominguez was on the radio. His voice had changed too, not dramatically, not unprofessionally, but the undertone was different. The undertone of a man who is reporting an outcome, not managing a crisis. He confirmed the probable engagement. He relayed Webb's status. He relayed the shelter's position and condition. He listened to the response, and this time the response made his jaw unclench by 1 degree, which for Dominguez was the equivalent of anyone else breaking into open relief. He came off the radio. Ground Medical is attempting the alternate route, ETA 50 to 90 minutes. Weather window for helicopter extraction is being monitored. Command says there may be a break in the system within 4 to 5 hours. 4 to 5 hours, which was better than 6 to 9, which was better than unknown. The math was improving. Midnight exactly. Elena was sitting against the back wall. The rifle was beside her, case open but unfastened. She had the notebook in her lap, but she was not writing. She was looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance, not the wall, not the room, somewhere beyond both of them, inside whatever place a person goes after they have spent 6 hours in the kind of concentrated effort that uses up everything. Mitchell sat down beside her, not across from her, beside her. The posture of someone who is not conducting a conversation, but sharing a space which was different and meant something different. They were quiet for a while. Then Mitchell said, "Can I ask you something personal?" She glanced at him. "You can ask." When you missed the first time, and then the second time was uncertain, what was going through your head? She thought about it. Really thought, not performing consideration, but actually going back there. "The next calculation," she said. "That's it. That's it. The miss happened and you can't unfire a bullet. The only thing that exists after a miss is the information you just gathered and what you do with it." Mitchell looked at his hands. Does it ever get to you, the pressure of it, what's riding on it? She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Mitchell glanced at her, wondering if she was going to answer. "Yes," she said, finally, quietly. "Not during there's no room for it. The math fills everything but before and after." She paused. "It gets to me before and after." "The before is the waiting," Mitchell said. "Yes." "What's the after?" "Dot." She looked at the notebook in her lap. "The after is knowing that the math worked, or knowing that it didn't. Either way, you have to live in the answer." She closed the notebook. "The math is the easy part. The living in the answer is the part that follows you." Mitchell sat with that. "What does living in tonight's answer feel like?" She looked at him. "Ask me in the morning," she said, "when I know for certain what the answer is." 12:17 a.m. The third shot from the ridge never came. They waited for it. Every person in that shelter was waiting for it in some part of their attention, the part that never fully relaxes in a situation like this, that monitors exits and angles and sounds, even when the conscious mind is occupied with other things. It was the part of the brain that combat writes to permanently, that stays on watch even when everything else has been given permission to rest. The third shot did not come. What came instead at 12:21 a.m. was a different sound entirely. Movement on the ridge, not the sound of a shot being taken, but the sound of a position being abandoned. Equipment being gathered footing, being changed the particular auditory signature of a person leaving a place they have occupied for a long time and leaving it in a hurry. It was a sound that existed below the storm, but above silence, and Elena, who was back at the aperture, not to shoot, just to listen, just to monitor, heard it first. "He's moving," she said. Dominguez was at her side in 3 steps. "Moving how?" "Retreating. The sound pattern is withdrawal, not repositioning." She listened for another 10 seconds. "He's going up and back, away from the ridge face." "The second operator," Dominguez said. Elena had been aware of the possibility of a second operator since the beginning. The tactical picture suggested 2-1 shooter, 1 spotter, the standard precision sniper configuration. She had been calculating for both tracking the possibility that a second gun might engage at any point. "If there's a second man up there, he just watched his partner go down," she said. "Or go silent. Either way, he's alone now and he doesn't know what he's dealing with." She paused. "Alone and uncertain is a dangerous combination for anyone, even a professional." "Dangerous how?" Reyes asked from across the room. "It means he might stay," Mitchell said slowly, "or it means he runs." "If I were him," Elena said, "I would run." The shelter listened to the ridge. For a long time, 4 minutes 5, the sounds from above were ambiguous. Movement that could have been anything. Wind playing across rock. The storm shifting weight. The unreliable acoustics of a mountain in winter. Then the sound stopped. And then there was nothing but the storm. 12:31 a.m. Dominguez said no shot in 30 minutes. Nobody needed him to say it. They had all been counting. "No repositioning sound in the last 10, Mitchell added. "She said he'd run," Reyes said quietly. They all looked at Elena. She was still at the aperture, still listening. Her face gave nothing. Then she said, "He's gone." The words were simple, 2 syllables. But the shelter received them the way a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time receives air, not gracefully, not quietly, but with the full force of everything that was being held back. Mitchell sat down heavily against the wall. He put his head back and looked at the ceiling and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere below his lungs. Reyes pressed his forehead against his knees and gripped the back of his own neck with both hands and stayed there for a moment in that private dark, just being alive. Dominguez keyed the radio. Tan looked at Webb. Webb was looking at Elena's back where she stood at the aperture, still monitoring, still at the wall, even though the watching was over, still at her post because that was who she was, and that was what she did. She stayed at the problem until she was certain, completely and absolutely certain that the problem was resolved. "Webb," Tan said. "Yeah," Webb said. His voice was thin, but it was there. "We're going to get you out of here." Webb looked at him. Then he looked back at Elena. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her tell her I said that was something." Tan stood up and crossed the shelter. He came up beside Elena and said quietly, "Webb wants you to know that was something." Elena did not turn from the aperture, but something shifted in her posture. Almost invisible. Almost nothing. "Tell him," she said, "that he did his part. He stayed." Tan went back and told him. Webb closed his eyes. And for the first time in 6 hours, the shelter breathed without weight. Outside, the storm continued. It was not done. It did not care that the engagement had concluded, or that a man's life had just expanded back toward its original length, or that a woman at a wall had spent 4 hours converting impossibility into 92% and then letting the mountain close the rest of the gap. The storm just moved the way storms move, enormous and indifferent. But inside the shelter, something had permanently changed. Not the situation. Not yet. The cold was still real. Webb still needed a hospital. The road was still blocked, and the helicopter was still grounded, and the mountain was still the mountain. But the weight of the impossible had been renegotiated. And in that shelter, in those 12 people, something that had been rigid and final, enclosed the certainty that certain things could not be done, that certain distances could not be crossed, that certain storms were simply too large for human intention to navigate. That certainty had developed a crack. And through the crack, cold and clear and exact as the bullet that had made it, something else had come in. Private Reyes would think about it for years afterward and never quite find the right word for it. It was not hope exactly. Hope was too soft for what it was. It was something harder, something with more structural integrity. It was the knowledge, direct experience inarguable that math done carefully enough and patience held long enough and certainty maintained against every pressure to abandon it, that these things could reach across distances that felt impossible and find what they were looking for. He had watched her do it. He had been there. And being there changed what he was willing to believe for the rest of his life. At 12:44 a.m., the radio confirmed the ground medical team had reached the alternate route junction, 55 minutes out. Webb heard the number and nodded once with the careful economy of a man who knows exactly how much energy he has left and has decided to spend it on exactly this. Elena finally stepped back from the aperture. She picked up the rifle. She began the post-engagement process, systematic, thorough, the closing steps of a protocol that had a beginning and a middle and an end, and she was at the end now, and she worked through it with the same quiet focus she had brought to every other step. Nobody spoke to her while she worked, not because they didn't want to, but because they understood, without needing it explained, that she was finishing something, that the finishing deserved the same respect as everything that had come before it. Mitchell watched her work. His face in the amber light was the face of a man who had started this night with a set of certainties and was ending it with an entirely different set. Not less certain more. Just certain about different things. He had been certain at 9 o'clock that no shot lands at that distance. He was certain now at 12:44 a.m. that the person who says that has simply not yet met the right mathematician. Elena closed the rifle case, latched it, stood up, looked at the shelter at the men at Webb in the corner, at Tan beside him at Dominguez, with the radio at Mitchell, who was looking back at her with the expression of someone who doesn't know what to say and has decided that's acceptable. She said nothing. She sat down against the back wall, put her notebook in her lap, and opened it to a blank page, and began in her careful column of numbers to document everything she had learned tonight. Because that was how you got better. You wrote down what the mountain taught you, and you did not waste a single lesson. 1:18 a.m. The ground medical team arrived 41 minutes ahead of their revised estimate. Nobody in the shelter heard them coming until they were at the door, 3 figures in cold weather gear. One of them carrying a trauma kit that was larger and better equipped than anything Tan had worked with all night. The door opened with the same controlled care Elena had used when she first arrived hours ago in what felt like a different geological era of this night, and the lead medic, a woman named Sergeant First Class Yolanda Price, who moved with the compressed efficiency of someone who has never once wasted emotion in her professional life, took exactly 4 seconds to assess the room before going directly to Webb. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask for a situation report. She looked at Webb, looked at Tan, said, "Walk me through it." And Tan began talking while her hands were already moving, already opening the kit, already doing 2 things simultaneously with the focused calm of someone who has arrived at a critical situation before and knows that the first 60 seconds are not for talking. Dominguez watched from the side wall with the expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been offered help with it. He did not hand the weight fully over. He was not that kind of commander, but he allowed himself for the first time in hours to stop calculating Webb's survival as a variable he was solely responsible for. Webb opened his eyes when Price's hands reached him. He looked at her face. "Hey," he said. "Hey yourself," she said, not looking up from what she was doing. "You're going to be okay." "People keep telling me that. People keep being right." Webb made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh that had come from him in hours. It cost him something, that sound, but he made it anyway because some things are worth what they cost. Reyes beside him felt something in his own chest release at the sound. Not fully, not completely, but enough. 1:34 a.m. While Price and her team worked on Webb, the rest of the shelter had begun the slow, careful process of reassembling itself after hours of contraction. The psychological unpacking that happens when a sustained crisis begins to resolve, when the body and mind that have been operating on emergency parameters start getting the signal that the emergency is ending and begin cautiously to stand down. It was not a comfortable process. Coming down from that kind of sustained tension never was. It had a physical component. The shakes that some men got, the sudden awareness of cold and hunger and exhaustion that had been deferred by adrenaline. The heaviness in the limbs that arrived when the body finally submitted its invoice for the hours it had spent in overdraft. And it had a psychological component, The thoughts that came in when the crisis stopped filling all available space. The things you had not let yourself think about while you were busy surviving. Private Reyes was experiencing both simultaneously. His hands were not quite steady. He noticed this without judgment, the way Elena had taught him to notice things as data, not verdict. His hands were trembling slightly, and that was information about what his body had been through, and the information was true and real, and he did not need to be ashamed of it. He was sitting against the wall with his knees up, and he was thinking about James Ortega. James had been dead since 4 in the afternoon. He had been dead for over 9 hours, and Reyes had not allowed himself to think about it, not fully, not in a way that went anywhere, because thinking about it fully in the middle of a survival situation was a luxury that the situation had not permitted. But now, in the relative quiet of a shelter where the immediate threat had withdrawn and a medical team was working, and the radio was carrying better news than it had carried all night, James Ortega's absence was making itself known. Not dramatically, not with the kind of sharp, tearing grief that movies preferred. It came in quietly the way the cold had come in at the beginning of this night, working through the layers, finding the gaps, settling into the spaces between bones. James had been funny. That was the thing Reyes kept landing on. In a situation like this, memory did not always go to the obvious places, to the significant moments, the memorable conversations, the things you would want to preserve. It went to the texture of a person. And the texture of James Ortega was that he was funny. Genuinely, specifically, situationally funny. The kind of humor that came from paying attention. That noticed the right absurd detail at the right moment and named it in a way that made everyone around him briefly lighter. Reyes sat with James for a few minutes in the privacy of his own head. That felt like the right thing to do. That felt like what was owed. Then Mitchell sat down beside him. Not across, beside. The same way he had sat beside Elena earlier, the posture of shared space rather than conversation. They sat quietly for a while. Then Mitchell said, "You thinking about Ortega?" "Yeah," Reyes said. "Me too," Mitchell said. They sat with that for another minute. "He would have had something to say about tonight," Reyes said. Mitchell made a sound. "He would have had 7 things to say about tonight. All of them inappropriate. All of them exactly right." Reyes exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Another silence. Comfortable in the way that silences between people who have been through the same thing can be the silence of a shared language that doesn't require speaking. Then Mitchell said, "I want to apologize to her." Reyes looked at him. "Elena. For what I said early on. The things I said in front of the whole unit about the shot being impossible." He paused. "I should say it directly. Not just shake her hand and act like the math erased it." "Mitchell," Reyes said. "What?" "She already forgave you. She forgave you before she finished loading her weapon." Mitchell looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because she asked you to call time," Reyes said. "She could have asked Dominguez. She asked you. She made you part of it." Mitchell sat with them, let it work on him the way real things work, slowly, thoroughly rearranging things that had been arranged a different way. "That's," he started, stopped, started again. "That's a specific kind of generous." "Yeah," Reyes said. "It is." 2:04 a.m. Price stood up from Webb's position and turned to Dominguez. Her face was the professional face, giving nothing, maintaining clinical distance, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from when she had arrived. "He's stable," she said. "We've got his pressure up, core temperature responding. The shoulder is going to need surgery, but the wound is clean, and the blood loss, while significant, is within survivable parameters." Dominguez looked at her for a long moment. "Survivable. He's going to make it," she said, dropping the clinical distance for exactly 1 second. "He's going to make it." Dominguez nodded once, the nod of a man who will not allow himself to show what that information is actually doing to him until he is somewhere alone and the mission is fully concluded. Tan still beside, Webb put his hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment. Then he put them down and looked at his own palms with the expression of a man who has just realized how hard he has been gripping something for a very long time and is now finally allowed to open his hands. Webb, for his part, had heard Price clearly. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Reyes. "What do you know?" he said. "You made it," Reyes said. "Yeah," Webb said. I wasn't entirely sure I was going to. Didn't want to say that before. Didn't want to," he stopped. Didn't want to put that weight on anyone. Reyes said, don't. Okay. Webb closed his eyes. Just let me lie here for a minute and be glad I'm still here. Yeah, Reyes said. Take all the time you need. 2:27 a.m. Elena had been writing in the notebook since 1 a.m. She had filled 11 pages. Reyes had watched her fill them, not reading. He was not close enough to read and would not have intruded, even if he were but watching the motion of her hand, the pace and pattern of the writing, which was not the writing of someone processing emotion, but the writing of someone conducting a technical debrief with themselves, documenting what the mountain had taught her, what the wind had taught her, what a target who moved in a specific pattern under specific pressures had taught her about the intersection of human behavior and ballistic physics. She was making it repeatable. That was the thing Reyes understood watching her. She was not just recording what had happened. She was converting the specific into the general, the experience into the principle, the singular event of this particular night, into knowledge that could be applied to the next situation that was different but contained similar variables. It was, he thought, the most professional thing he had ever witnessed. And it was also, he thought, though, he would struggle to explain this to anyone who hadn't been there, one of the most human things he had ever witnessed. Because underneath the clinical precision of it, underneath the columns of numbers and the technical notation, there was an act of profound respect. Respect for the difficulty of what had been done. Acknowledgement that nothing this hard should be allowed to disappear without being understood. At 2:27, she closed the notebook. She looked up. The shelter was quiet around her Price's team, working in focused efficiency, the rest of the men in various states of physical and psychological recovery. Dominguez at the radio with a new quality of calm in his voice that was entirely different from the contained crisis management of the last several hours. Elena looked at the rifle case. Then she looked at Reyes. He had been watching her and had not hidden the fact quickly enough. She did not seem to mind. How long have you been sitting there? She asked. A while, he said. Did you sleep? No. You should try. Yeah, he said. I know. He paused. Are you going to? She looked at the wall above the aperture, the new apertures that Mitchell's bleeding knuckles had made. Not yet, she said. The second operator, Reyes said. She looked at him, slightly surprised, not that he had considered, but that he had said it first. He retreated, she said. But you're not sure he's gone. I'm 92% sure, she said, and for the first time tonight, something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one. There's that 8%. Reyes looked at the aperture. You're going to watch until dawn. Until the extraction window opens, she said. Yes. He nodded, stood up slowly, working the circulation back into his left leg, walked to his kit, took out a second protein bar, walked back and set it beside her the same way he had set down the first one hours ago without ceremony. She looked at it, looked at him. You've been feeding me, she said. Somebody has to, he said. She picked it up. This time she opened it. Thank you, Private. Reyes, he said. Danny Reyes. She looked at him. That way measuring direct look she had given him the first time he had spoken to her, back when she had first arrived and the shelter was full of skepticism and fear. The look that cataloged and retained. Danny Reyes, she said. San Antonio. He blinked. I told you about San Antonio. You told Webb. Sound carries in a stone shelter. You heard all of that. The dog story, she said, and the part about your grandmother. He stood for a moment, not quite knowing what to do with the information that Elena Hart, while building a second firing solution in her head and tracking a hostile sniper's movement pattern and monitoring an 18-minute wind lull cycle, had also heard the story about his dog. Sorry, he said. I wasn't trying to distract you. You weren't a distraction, she said. It helped. He looked at her. How? She thought about it, genuinely thought the way she did everything completely without corners cut. It reminded me what I was calculating for, she said. Not just the math, what the math was protecting. She looked at Webb's position across the shelter. When the numbers are all you have, sometimes you lose the reason. What you heard was it was the reason. Walking around the room in a story about a boy and a grandmother and a kid in San Antonio who needed to keep his sergeant alive. Reyes did not have a response that was adequate for that. He stood with it for a moment, then said quietly, Well, you're welcome. "Good night, Danny Reyes," she said. "Good night, Staff Sergeant Hart." He went back to his position. He did not sleep, but he closed his eyes, and in the space behind them, James Ortega was funny again, and Webb was breathing steadily, and Elena Hart was at the wall. And that was enough, 3:51 a.m. The radio brought news that changed the night's final shape. Command had confirmed a developing break in the weather system, not a full clearing, not the kind of blue sky dawn that made for good photographs, but a navigable window. Visibility projection for the extraction zone was crossing the 500-meter threshold at approximately 0530, possibly earlier. One helicopter fully equipped was already pre-positioned and on standby 40 kilometers south, crew briefed, rotors ready. Dominguez relayed this to the shelter in his even unconflected voice. The response was different from what a response to good news usually looked like. It was not loud. It was not celebratory. It was the response of people who have been in sustained crisis long enough that they no longer trust good news immediately, who receive it carefully, hold it at arm's length for a moment, test its edges before allowing themselves to believe in it. Then Webb said from the corner, "Oh, 5:30. Roughly," Dominguez said. "That's 99 minutes. Give or take." Webb looked at the ceiling. "I can do 99 minutes, he said. "I know you can," Dominguez said. "I just want it on the record that I said so," Webb said, in front of witnesses. "Noted," Dominguez said, "for the record." Mitchell, from his position near Elena, said, "Also for the record, and I want this formally noted as well. I was wrong earlier tonight. What I said about the shot. I was wrong, and I said it loud, and I want it equally loud in the record that I was wrong." Nobody laughed. This was not the moment for it, but something passed through the shelter. A warmth and acknowledgement, the group's recognition of a man doing a necessary and effortful thing. Elena said without turning from the aperture. "Mitchell." "Yeah," he said. "It's in the record," she said. "Both parts." He was quiet for a moment. "Both parts, that you said it and that you changed your mind." She paused. "The second part matters more than the first." 4:19 a.m. The twist that nobody had prepared for came at 4:19, and it came from the radio. Dominguez had been in periodic contact with the command through the night, and the contact had been routine situation updates, resource coordination, the standard traffic of a unit managing a prolonged engagement. But at 4:19, the communication changed character. Dominguez listened for longer than usual. His responses shortened. His face did the thing it did when information was rearranging something inside him that he had been operating on for hours. He came off the radio and looked at Elena. She had turned from the aperture. She was looking at him because she had heard the change in the traffic pattern, the way she heard everything, not the content, but the shape, the rhythm, the deviation from established baseline. "Command has a visual," Dominguez said. "Drone surveillance asset just came online east of the ridge, thermal imaging." "The ridge position," Elena said. "One confirmed heat signature. No movement. Position consistent with your impact calculation." He held her gaze. "It's confirmed, Staff Sergeant. Impact confirmed." The shelter absorbed this. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The confirmation settled into the room the way the last piece of a long equation settles, not with surprise, because the logic had been pointing this direction for hours, but with the particular weight of certainty closing over probability. The 8% collapsing to 0. Mitchell sat very still. Reyes opened his eyes. Tan stopped what he was doing and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Price, who had not been present for any of what had preceded this moment, who did not have the context of the whole long night, looked at the faces around her and read in them something that made her go quiet in a respectful way, without fully understanding why. Webb turned his head toward Elena. "Confirmed," he said. "Confirmed," Dominguez repeated. Webb looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he said something that he had been composing in his current, deliberate and careful way for some time. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want everyone here to hear it because these are the people who were here." Nobody spoke. "I've been in the Army for 12 years, Webb said. His voice was thin, but the structure underneath it was solid. "I have worked with extraordinary people, men and women who did things under pressure that I could not have predicted they were capable of. And I have never, not once, in 12 years, been in a room where someone did what she did tonight." He stopped, breathed. The math, the patience, He stopped again. This time because he had run into the edge of what language could do. He knew it, and he did not try to push past it. "I'm alive," he said finally. "That's what I've got. I'm alive. And she's the reason." Elena stood at the wall. She did not turn around. Her right hand moved to her left pocket where the notebook was. She did not take it out. She just held the pocket closed with her hand the way you hold something you are not ready to put down. Then she turned around. She looked at Webb. She looked at all of them, Mitchell, Reyes, Dominguez, Tan Price, the others, all the faces of men who had been through the same long, dark night and were still here to look back at her. She said, "Thank you for letting me do my job." That was all. Mitchell made a sound that started as something he was going to suppress and didn't manage to. He covered it by looking at the wall, which didn't fool anyone, but nobody remarked on it. Reyes did not try to cover anything. He just sat with what he felt and let it be what it was. 5:17 a.m. The helicopter came in from the south at 5:17, 13 minutes ahead of the projected window. They heard it before they saw any external confirmation. A change in the quality of sound above the diminished storm, a mechanical rhythm beneath the remaining wind that every person in the shelter recognized simultaneously, and that produced in the recognition a collective physical response that was not quite a sound and not quite a movement, but was unmistakably a thing, the body's involuntary acknowledgement that rescue was real and not theoretical anymore. Dominguez confirmed with the pilot over radio, coordinates exchanged, LZ confirmed, ET to touchdown 4 minutes. Price and her team were already moving efficient, practice converting Webb's position from stationary treatment to mobile transport, with the streamlined precision of a process done many times before. Webb was talking to him through the movement, asking questions about the helicopter, about the hospital, the kind of talking that people do when they need the evidence of their own voice to confirm they are still present and still engaged. "Am I going to be able to eat a real meal tomorrow?" he asked Price. "You're going to want liquids for the first 24 hours, she said. "That's not what I asked." "Tomorrow night," she said, "something soft." "I want a burger," Webb said. "Sergeant Webb. A real one, not a hospital one." "We'll discuss it," Price said, which was medic for no, but delivered with enough diplomatic cushion that Webb accepted it and moved on. Mitchell was at the door. He had taken a position there not assigned, not directed, simply having placed himself where he was useful, where he could manage the opening and closing as the unit prepared to move, standing guard over the transition, the way he had stood guard over his skepticism earlier in the night, with the same focused commitment now redirected entirely toward usefulness. Elena was at the wall. She was still at the wall. Dominguez looked at her. "Hart, we move in 3. "I know," she said. She did not move from the wall. He understood. He did not push. She was watching the ridge. One final observation window, one final check of the 8% that was now 0, but that deserved confirmation regardless. She was closing out the problem the same way she had opened it, with attention, with respect for what the problem had cost and what it had required, with her eye on the math until the last possible moment. At 2 minutes before extraction, she stepped back from the aperture. She picked up the rifle case. She looked at the aperture one more time, at the 2 holes Mitchell's hands had bled to make, at the original observation gap she had used for the first attempt, at the wall that had taken a bullet for them and held. She said nothing. She turned to the door. 5:41 a.m. The helicopter cleared the valley at 5:41 a.m. bank south and accelerated toward the hospital with Webb in the back and Price's hands on him and the mountains below them, white and enormous and indifferent to what had just happened inside them. In the helicopter, Webb was talking again. He was talking because Price had asked him to, because keeping him verbal was part of the protocol, but also because Webb had decided in the clear, present, grateful way of a man who has just gotten to keep his life that he was not going to spend any of his remaining time being quiet about things worth saying. He told Price about Elena Hart. He told her about the notebook and the numbers and the 18-minute lull cycles and the 2 hours of calculation before the first shot and the miss and the recalculation and the pattern mapping of an enemy who thought he was invisible and the final shot through 2 seconds and 9/100ths of a second of frozen air. Price listened with the attention she gave to most things, professional, genuine, taking it in. When Webb finished, she said, "And she did all of this in one night." "In one night," Webb said, "starting from scratch, with a unit that didn't believe in her." "Who came around?" Webb said. "Mitchell especially. And Reyes never doubted. I think Reyes just operates differently than most people. How so, Q? Webb thought about it. He decides to trust, and then he trusts all the way. No hedging. He gave her all of it from the start, and I think that mattered. To her, even if she wouldn't say so. Price was quiet for a moment. Then what happens to her now, Hart? Webb looked at the ceiling of the helicopter. Back to wherever they keep people like her, he said. Until the next impossible situation. Are there a lot of those? Enough, Webb said. The world keeps generating them. 6:14 a.m. The storm broke at 6:14 a.m. Not gradually. It broke the way certain things break, with a definite quality of ending a shift from one state to another that had a clear before and after. The cloud system that had pressed down on the valley for 14 hours lifted and thinned, and the light that came through was the early winter light of high mountain altitude, cold and absolute, with the specific quality of illumination that arrives after a long dark has ended and finds everything exactly where it was but somehow changed. The unit that remained on the ground for final equipment recovery moved through the aftermath of their night in the particular silence of people who have been through something together that cannot be entirely spoken. They worked efficiently. They communicated what needed to be communicated. They did what needed to be done. Reyes worked beside Mitchell. They did not talk much. They did not need to. At one point, Mitchell stopped. He was looking at the ridge that was visible for the first time, the actual geography, the actual terrain, the actual distance between the valley floor and the high ground where the threat had lived all night. 1,638 meters. Standing at the base looking up, it was not a number anymore. It was a place. A real, physical, enormous distance filled with air and cold, and everything a bullet had to survive to get from here to there. Mitchell stood and looked at it for a long time. She calculated all of that, he said, not to Reyes specifically, to himself, to the ridge, to whatever listening there was in a mountain that had just watched something extraordinary use it as a stage. She did, Reyes said, in a notebook, with a pencil, in a blizzard. With 2 compromised apertures, Reyes said, and a target who kept moving. Mitchell was quiet. I told her it couldn't be done. I know. I was so certain. Reyes looked at the ridge too, at the actual distance of it. We're always certain, he said, right up until the moment we see someone do the thing we were certain about. Mitchell looked at him. When did you get philosophical? About 3 a.m., Reyes said, somewhere between the second shot and the wind shift. Mitchell almost smiled. It was brief and real, and it was the first one of the night. Come on, he said, let's finish up. They finished up 7:52 a.m. The official report filed 3 days later contained one sentence that addressed the engagement directly. It read, confirmed long-range precision engagement beyond 1,630 meters in blizzard conditions, resulting in neutralization of hostile threat and successful unit extraction. One sentence. No name, no notebook, no 18-minute lull cycles, no second aperture, no pattern mapping of a target's movement habits, no 2 hours of calculation on a cold stone floor. No Mitchell's skepticism and Mitchell's conversion. No Webb's voice in the corner holding on. No Reyes and his protein bars and his dog story that reminded a sniper what she was protecting. One sentence. Bureaucratic, flat, deliberately unglamorous. That was how it worked. That was the nature of the world that people like Elena Hart operated in. The things they did vanished into official language that recorded the outcome and erased the architecture, the extraordinary human architecture of patience and skill and knowledge and refusal to accept impossibility that made the outcome possible. But the men who were in that shelter knew. They knew the architecture. They had lived inside it for a night. They had felt its weight in its structure and its specific unperformable quality, the thing that exists only in the real, only in the presence of, only in the living through. And that knowing was not in any report. It did not need to be. Reports were for institutional memory. What happened in that shelter was a different kind of memory, the kind that lives in the body, in the specific recall of a held breath at 10:53 p.m., and a rifle firing at 11:27, and a silence stretching for 3 minutes, while a shelter waited to know if 92% was going to be enough. The kind of memory that changes what a person believes is possible, because that was the real outcome of that night, not the confirmed engagement, not the successful extraction, not the one sentence in the official record. The real outcome was 11 men who went into a valley believing certain things about distance and weather and what human skill could reach across, and who came out of it believing something different. Not louder about it, not demonstrative, just different in the quiet structural way that real experience changes a person, not on the surface, but underneath, at the level where the foundational assumptions live. Mitchell went back to his unit, and he never again said the word impossible, the way he had said it in that shelter. He caught himself approaching it a couple of times over the years, that comfortable certainty that something was beyond the reach of what a person could do. And every time he caught himself, he stopped. He thought about a woman with a notebook and a pencil and a two-finger gap in an insulated wall. And he asked himself instead, have I done the math carefully enough to know? Usually the answer was no. Reyes went back to San Antonio on leave 3 weeks later. He sat in his mother's kitchen and he told her about the night, not all of it, not the classified parts, but enough. And his mother listened the way mothers listen, completely, with the particular attention that comes from loving a person and needing to understand what has happened to them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, this woman, this Staff Sergeant Hart, is she all right? Reyes thought about that. I think so, he said. I think she's probably somewhere writing numbers in a notebook. His mother nodded. Good, yeah, she said. And then she made him a meal that was not a hospital meal and was not a field ration, but was the specific food of a specific kitchen in San Antonio made by someone who loved him, which was its own kind of calculation. The equation that says you matter done in flour and heat and the time it takes to feed someone properly. Webb recovered fully. The surgery took 4 hours. The rehabilitation took longer. He was back in the field in 7 months, which his surgeon told him was fast, and which Webb received as information, rather than praise, because getting back was the goal, and fast was just the speed at which you reached it. He never talked about Elena Hart publicly. He talked about her privately to people he trusted in the specific and deliberate way of someone conveying something they consider important and do not want diluted by casual repetition. He told the story the way she had built the shot carefully, completely accounting for all the variables, leaving nothing out. And every time he told it, he said the same thing at the end. He said, from that night forward, when someone tells me something is impossible, I don't argue with them. I just think about what it would take to sit in that shelter for 6 hours and do the math. And I ask myself whether I've sat long enough and worked hard enough to have earned that word. Usually the answer is no, and the word stays unspoken. Because the night Elena Hart fired across 1,638 meters of frozen mountain air, she did not just make a shot. She changed the distance that the word impossible was willing to travel. She proved in the language of numbers and patience, and a bullet that crossed 2 seconds and 9/100ths of a second of dark, that impossible is not a law. It is only a failure of calculation. And Elena Hart did not fail at calculation. She never had, and she never would.